I just want to say thank you so much to Dottie and to all of the organizers who have made this event possible. This has been really wonderful so far, and I'm so glad to take it all in. So my name is Jordan. I am a writer, person of things, and also, I guess, a scholar sometimes, but mostly I do the academic stuff because it's a convenient home for me as a person who doesn't make a ton of money from my writing, because it's poetry, mostly. So I wanted to, in thinking about this theme about water, which is something that I actually write a lot, something that I've written a lot about recently. But I guess, that writing is kind of buried sometimes in my other writing, which maybe that doesn't make sense at this moment, but hopefully I'll try and talk you through it. So I wrote this book just a couple of years ago, and it's coming out with McClellan and Stewart in April. I have no idea, do McClellan and Stewart books make it to America? No. Anyway, it's a Canadian publisher. They're publishing this book. I'm from Canada. And it will eventually make its way here, I assume. I think with a different international publisher. I don't know who that's going to be at this point, but somebody, eventually you'll see this book. And it's a book about intergenerational trauma. It's about the wake. It's about writing in the wake of Indian residential schools. It's about, I guess, indigenous connections to nationhood, and indigenous knowledges when those connections have been severed by way of colonial violence. And it's also a book about me and my family and my grandparents, and it's a book that is very personal, and also very difficult in a lot of ways, because it's about intergenerational cycles of violence. So when I was writing this book, it became very important for me at one point or another to put my personal artistic output in conversation with my dad's artistic output. And this becomes clear in the book itself, but my dad is a Niska artist, but is also not a person that's in my life. And part of the narrative of this book is me getting to know my dad through his artistic output. So this image here is both my art and my dad's art. So the actual shape of the frog is from my dad's paintings, and the text inside of it, as well as there's a photograph part inside of this text that's from archival photographs from my family archive, and then the text part of it is my artistic output. And these are a bunch of the images that appear in this book that's coming out later in the spring. So I'll just kind of show you a few of them and then talk about it a bit more. So, I mean, as you can probably tell from these images, the text itself is actually very difficult to read. And if it's completely illegible to you in terms of these slides in this presentation, it is a bit more legible on the page itself. And these images are not, they're higher quality in the print book. But I think for the purposes of this talk, it maybe makes sense for me to read some of this work to you, and also to talk to you about the conceptual origins of the work. So the work in these concrete images, so the textual work, which is my work, comes from a project called Empty Spaces. And it's a project that began it began shortly after I read this book by Roxanne Ortiz called Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. Has anyone read that book? 1? 2? Okay, yeah, kind of. Okay, we got 2.5, that's okay. So there's it's a really good book, you should totally read it. But there's this part of that book that as an Indigenous literary studies scholar and as a literary studies person in general, I find really interesting. And it's this part of this book where Dunbar Ortiz talks about the last of the Mohicans. And she makes this argument in that book that the last of the Mohicans was I guess a narrative that was instrumental in nullifying guilt related to genocide and fictionalizing this kind of origin myth of the United States. And I thought that was a very powerful statement to make about a piece of literature. And she also mentions that, or she also argues that for many of the generations of young white men who read The Last of the Mohicans, they read it more as nonfiction than fiction, which of course, I think, is really interesting and also really problematic. So after reading an Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, I became really interested in The Last of the Mohicans, and started reading. I started reading it and reading around it. And one of the places that I ended up in my reading around this book was Goodreads, as one does, to see who's reading this book, how they're thinking through it, how they're interacting with it. And on Goodreads, it seems that many of the people who are reading this book right now appear to be American high school students, or at least those are the ones who are commenting on Goodreads. And they really hate it, I think, for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons is that they seem to really, really despise James Fenimore Cooper's endless descriptions of land and nature in the book. They think it's boring. They think it's a boring book. And I disagree with them a little bit. I also dislike the book quite a bit, but for very different reasons. So I started thinking about James Fenimore Cooper's descriptions of land and nature in The Last of the Mohicans, and I started writing over them, I started writing through them, I started writing with them, I started writing around them, in order to disrupt that, vision of American land as terra nullius. So that's the text. That project is the text that's there. And I will read some of it for you. And hopefully in this in this reading, it'll start to tie together with all the other presentations that we've heard. A deep, narrow chasm, black rocks. The river lies still on those black rocks. A mile above there is a tumbling. There is a moment. At this very moment there is a tumbling in the air a mile above us that runs straight through the open heavens and into some other place. A deep hollow, no shape, no consistency, no breaking some 100 feet in the air. Some places are softer than others, some 100 feet up in the air. Some right angles enter into narrow passageways, and some right angles break off a mile in the air above us. These rocks are full of cracks. Water has worked through some deep hollows, breaking here, wearing there, breaking and wearing until the chasm separates into two caverns. Some 100 feet in the air there is no danger. There is scattered driftwood in the scent of roses. There are glimpses of roses and rocks and shrubs. There is a steep, rugged ascent, a path that winds among the black rocks and trees. Somewhere in the air there is the scent of roses. Somewhere out there is the wilderness, a reasonable distance through scenes of greenery and nature and glimpses of mountain ranges that disappear just as suddenly as they appear. Among the rocks and trees there are mounds of earth and other rocks and other driftwood. Somewhere there is an islet and another islet and a clear sheet of water and bold rocks just beneath the surface. There are forests and straits and islets and rocks, and somewhere in the air is the scent of roses. There are crevices and fissures and rocks. The rocks surround themselves in other rocks, although there are sometimes mounds of earth in between. On the shore, there are fragments of rocks. In the deeper parts of the river, there is more tumbling. At this very moment, the river pours into a wide fissure where it just becomes more water between rocks. Between the broken rocks and the deep, roaring cavern, there is a scent of roses and driftwood and trees. There is light and straight, naked rocks and immovable trees. There are woods and rivers, and the bed of that river is ragged with rocks and intersecting ravines that cut silently across the water above, where somewhere in the air is a scent of roses. The woods are full of sounds and rocks and trees. The woods are full. The upper air, where it drifts over the tops of trees, is full of sounds. Just where it breaks over the tops of trees, there are slow intermingling drifts of sounds and scents that brush over the clearing some 50 or 60 feet up in the air. Rocks and logs and mounds of earth and narrow fissures and bottomland and little ponds and a brook that shoots through the narrow fissures, spreading through moment after moment of stretched light. There is a bellowing in the passageways between the rocks. There are moments of admonished madness. There are moments spreading over the acres of bottomland. There are precipices and adjacent lakes and headwaters. There is a fierceness here that flows through the waters. These rivers are full to the brim. These waters stream down to our feet. In 6 hours, these waters will rush in, and in another 6 hours, these waters will rush out. Salt grows in this water, the water in the woods and on the Great Lakes and in the higher parts of the sea, stretching out horizontally until the current flows upward like blood at the throat. On these waters, the edges touch the shores and the deer paths trace back to the streams. In the short distance in between the water and the black rocks is a deep shadow. The breath of the stream, the glancing waters, the throat of the river. These woods are full. Gliding above, somewhere up in the impenetrable darkness, is the scent of roses. Somewhere there is the sound of rushing waters ringing through the deep stillness of the night. The moon rises and the light glances here and there on the water and down to the riverbed. At times the light hangs in the air on the breath of the river. There are dark waters, there is night. This is the unmingled sweetness of air that sinks into the foaming waters. These are the vaults of forest. There is a stillness here somewhere in the wilderness. There is lightning and then there is stillness. There are echoes that rush through the forest until they disappear. A mile above there is a tumbling. In the foaming waters there is the color of blood gushed from some other place, some other throat, some other softer place. Some waters carry the dead. Somewhere up in the air there is a scent of roses. Some flames last forever. Some waters thicken with limbs and bodies and trembling voices. Some waters are still. Somewhere in the velocity of the uproar there is a current of air, an unmingled sweetness that sinks into the forest. The narrow path adjacent to the brook is full of bodies. The blood is natural as water. Glassy mirrors, the sunken hillsides, the shores, the black rocks between the mounds of earth, the glittering stars, the open air floating over the forest. In the valley, the stream overflows onto the banks. Here, the tumbling water washes bones, and the waters of the river go into the salt lake. There is a canopy from the woods spreading over the lake, shadowing a dark current with a deep hue. When the sun is setting, these waters become healing waters, but the sun is not setting, and the current branches silently into the dark parts of the lake. Somewhere in the forest, bark is peeled from a tree. Branches break. For many minutes, there is a struggle and a deep, cool wind. There is a current of air. There is silent motion, plunging and glancing and sweeping over the broken branches. The sound from the rushing waters drifts through the air. There are words and yells and cries as the air flows up from somewhere in the deep, narrow ravine. There is silence again, with the exception of the sounds that come from the rushing water. There are many more pages, and it all actually kind of goes on like that. So maybe that's a good point to stop. And thank you for your time and your patience.
I want to thank everyone who's here, everybody who was presenting prior, the person who will be presenting after, and thank you, Dottie and Cecilia, for welcoming us all here. Fire, that is the poem I call Fire. Prior called blurred and or blurring, then transubstantiation, I wrote first to be about spiritual and secular music. How I figured they figure in some black life. A matter, you see, of turning the magic word Jesus to baby in one's open singing mouth. Or of turning the Orphic O, a chaste solo vowel, to the howling carnal O, bearing its multi-partite genital H. Eros, or some formulation like it, rippled under the blurred and or blurring's surface. This I know I knew. What I didn't know then but know now is that this poem is about thirst, about drought, being thirsty, that it's fluid movement, it's running in some kind of way, like how a feeling is felt, was a matter of whose body I meant to fix that thirst into. Drowning eye, a kind of thieving fixed to look like a seeing. I wrote the blurred and or blurring while churched in Southern California, the desert at being itself, despite how much green developers spot-colored their brochures. Blurred and or blurring. God, we cry, because nobody do us like the body. Oh, Jesus, the baby, Jesus, baby, oh, baby, love me. This we know. Insert here low enough to keep us high enough for when we feel filled with it. Not too proud for kneeling. Still, the fallen world punctures the sanctum, dirt thrust up a mouth. When people die, literaturally, the soul sperms free. Vice versa, perspiration, melisma, flood altos, rocking shoulders. So just digger O for O, brothers and sisters. No, don't figure nobody when you think on that blood, though we must lord, else ain't mere young Americans. The draft was an argument about the attenuation of soul music to pop music via the cut between body and spirit. The blurred and or blurring is a title come from a list, come from an essay, come from what was Fred Moten's sustained reckonings with Kant. The essay, Black Kant, among many wonders, proposes a natural history of inequality. That natural history, as I understand it, exists in that essay as a list of categories / qualities. I was thirsty for this list, thirsty as in wanting something from it, to be with it, this list, to be with it as in to spend time in its company, but also to understand it. Oh, that list. How to understand that list, which as I understood in that essay, Moten proposed it, not as central to his thesis. And here I may misremember in the dizziness of my thirst as in, but as something that might grow later, maybe if watered. I meant to water it with my thirst, which is perhaps a way of understanding devotion. This list, at my last count, is this: 1, the stupid; 2, the irrational; 3, the deformed and or deformative; 4, the unfinished and or disruptive; 5, the driven and or transportive; 6, the irregular and or anti-regulative; 7, the blurred and or blurring; 8, the curved; 9, the canted; 10, the arabesque; 11, the paragon; 12, the outwork and or mad absence of the work; 13, the outlaw; 14, the would have been outside; 15, the thing of nature that defies or defers rather than presupposes representation; and 16, the social whose life and exhaustion of the given has often been mistaken for death. My devotion to this list set a ritual. I write a short something for each category. The title of each would correspond with a characteristic. The first sentence would be some kind of interpretation of the next category on the list, related, however, to the titular category. The writing would proceed like this until I had cycled back round. Put concretely, the blurred and or blurring corresponded with number 7 on the list. The piece's first sentence must curve, number 8. The next must cant, number 9. The third must perform an arabesque, number 10, and so on until the piece ends with a sentence that reckons with the irregular and or anti-regulative, number 6, all engaged with the themes of the piece at hand. The blurred and or blurring was an attempt at this, but it faltered. I had somehow missed 3 listed categories: the deformed and or deformative, the unfinished and or disruptive, the driven and or transportive. Thus, this version of the blurred and or blurring went under for a while. Deep shape of it from once under. All I could see was what I could. Something that pushes but wasn't in my eyes save for burning. Wasn't but my eyes save for wetness that pushed me. And the wetness I have in my eye, out my eye that I gave it. If it isn't from a hole, then it isn't from me. What is it there, and was it what I could drink it, down deep in the shape of it except where I am? Would I could drink it, and leave nothing of me. There, the shape of me, that's what it'd be. There I am in it, except where I am, except that it take me. Turn what is flesh into all that it is. In the time that I'm in it, but out while I'm in it, from what moved on top that was sound and rough surface. A surface, what would I move hands over top it, as it moves its keel like a feeling cuts through it. What parts of rough surface turn ships in my hands, slim keels would ride in me the whirls of my hands. The pools they find there under callus and skin bank. Then I am on ship, am ship with ship in me. The sliver finds ocean of easy red water. Greedy sea I see when I look overboard, at the indifferent sea that shrugs at what holds me. There I hold it and let out all my nothing. There I hold it and let out all my nothing. Fire, that is the poem I call Fire. Prior called the blurred and or blurring, then transubstantiation. I wrote first to be about spiritual and secular music, how I figured they figured in some black life. When the blurred and or blurring was turned, it turned first into transubstantiation. Loosed from the tight cycle of its unnatural history, I reckoned I could break it free of its vessel, but I knew not what its vessel was, thinking it was the form, the cycle, but I knew not what. What I thought I knew was I had the answer, that what had to happen was I had to show a drought existed, to finger the dust where I too coughed there in my desert yellow thirst. What ran true? And into the next draft was soul sperms free, vice versa, perspiration, melisma flood. The fluids in and of the poem. Too easy to call these lubricants, but they loosed me into something. The sweat in somebody's sanctuary. The wet that turns singing into sangin', the wet that coaxes the multipartite H from the O. The argument as dry. It coughed and dust came up. What was wet in it was the soul sperming. Too easy. But there was something ectoplasmic to it, a viscosity. I returned and returned to the wetness versus dryness. How was that not an Eros or something like it? How was that not the desert or something like it? The major change in transubstantiation. I staged a kind of congress in the choir, like a kind of orgy, but not, and yet thinking about the lyrics of so many devotional songs. The Eros in their surrender and devotion to Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. What ran from the runnel off the soprano's keen pierced down through and into the bass's deep black zenith, for to be licked, for to be lapped. Here the water became associated with performance. The sweat from the Lufu key of exertion. The work it of the you better work, which is to say black work, which is to say you better work, which is to say compelling, by which I mean to say arresting, no, I should say forceful, but I mean to say it became associated with spit, like when you are not singing but singing, not up there for no form or fashion, because performance, when I'm not sure I'm putting on a show, is as close as I come to devotion as in worship. Like I was giving a reading at an Alabama gallery. It was going well. In the middle of the banter between poems, the bottle of water the host had provided for me fell. It just fell to the floor from what? Music stand, lectern? That I can't recall, but there it fell. And what was I saying there before it fell? Well, I don't remember for it being lost to a vessel, water, to an interruption involving water. When it hit, I stopped. I saw it there rolling a little, listing. Oh, it listed, and I dropped because there was nothing else to do. I fell to the floor next to it, got down to see its level. Oh, how was I doing? And I looked at that bottle of water there, and I said, "How dare you embarrass me in front of all these people?" And when it refused to apologize or acknowledge how it had ruptured, interrupted my flow, and I promise I tried talking. I tried to reason with that bottle of water, but it wouldn't bend, so I began to wrestle. Oh, I went at that bottle of water, and we struggled, we vied, we grappled down the alley from the lectern to the music stand. We went down the aisle and ended up back on the floor and rolled there a bit before we reached an impasse, a kind of detente. We stopped there, uneasy, and made our way back to the mic. What was that? Lectern, the music stand, I said, "I'm sorry, everyone, but black folk and water have had a difficult relationship," and launched into a poem about the middle passage. Or, like the time last year at Boise State University, when I noticed they gave me Life Water brand bottled stylized geometrically sans A and E, so that LIFEWTR would be roughly the same size. And I remarked, I'll provide your A and E for the evening. My people are great with arts and entertainment, especially when brought to you by water. Every so often during the performance, I would stage a commercial break for like water. And at one point when I realized I'd have to pour some on my head, and so did, trying to recall whether I had a lavalier mic to make sure I wouldn't be bringing a little Shango into the show. But the wet here in transubstantiation splashed against a repetition, mortised rigorously across the typographic field, made to wet a robot, made to wet the arid. For transubstantiation, like the blurred and or blurring, pride thought it was the water, and not the thirst. It argued first that what was at stake was flesh on the one and spirit on the other. That if the spiritual forgot the corporeal, it would leave a ghost. And as Alexis, Pauline Guns, and Fred Moten told me at a talk, a ghost is dead, but a spirit is not. But if the corporeal forget the spiritual, it would leave only me. To market, what Orphic O and aroused O. These O's marched across the page in rigid tabs, factory sprockets, for assembly, for shipping from factories, to stream to the mainland. How I wanted to keep what was ours was mine. Drowning on. The poem didn't fail because of this tension. It failed me because it let me lie and lie. When I feel a spirit, it's wet how it comes over. It pulls me to where I must be, that I must be meant to be. I go there with what flow there, and I see as if things have gotten for a moment clear. Holding the light water bottle, I knew I must pour the light water bottle on my head. To choose not to was a choice I could make, but it would be a choice not to be present. To disappear from what I could see in truth in a moment. In moments like that, I feel I'm not just performing. Audience more like the organ than the people listening to it. Fire. That is the poem I call Fire. Prior called The Blurred and or Blurring, and then Transubstantiation. I wrote first to be about spiritual and secular music. How I figured they figured in some black life. When transubstantiation turned fire, I fixed to be in my thirst. Not to see it in others, but to get it in me and have it. Fire grieves now what I can't see me getting. What I feel in my robe, I lose seated in rows. That the sweat and spit, these things of the spirit, dry against the hot wind out the mouths of some preachers. Language shaped by drowning eyes. Fire. Is that what happened? Fire. God, we cry, because nobody do us like the body. Oh, Jesus, love me. This I, no place low enough to keep me high enough. For when I feel filled with it, I am not ashamed to kneel, not ashamed to sing. When I have that name in my mouth, and O turned O, and I turned A, I am saying and turned what I owe to the blood, what flowed, what we owe, alive, that body by that spirit. What's flowing by the spirit isn't ghost, lest we ghost it. I from the robe in the body of or up in it. My body up in my robe. My eye roll up to lift, to wonder from where I get what come. What's ghost isn't spirit. Spirit, what guides sopranos, keen pierce. It's lit, sweet glow high enough, radiating, sweat before me. What rides high the pierce they make to go inside us is, oh, in this place. Death can't shake pearl rung. What runnels me, what runs so alto the body of this, the blood was shed. Come quiver, come quaver, climb lower, oh go down, oh do I. Chimes, entertainers, swayers, sang now, get happy, they got it in them, get it in me, filled with what ode. I know it was, I know it was, I know it was, the blood bear down over it, a cleft bowed low enough for the tremulous tremor, the things of the spirit in this place, the basins, we come, go down, not ashamed, I, to come, go down, oh deep black zenith, God, go down, lift up, take in what's licked, sweet body of the body of what's on high, oh go down, oh, 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 that God, good spirit, flow, pierce, one sway, bow, but we owe the body, I see, we sang, a sweet body of we give, I know it was, what flow, in the row, in the body of the things of the spirit, I try to rock, trimmer, turn thing, nobody, I know it was, my mouth full of sweat, what chime with what I know it was supposed to be, but shed like a skin, like a robe, oh, I went down to the road, the sweet body of, I see, I hear, what's said, was too ashamed to owe, what flowed from the spirit, I know it wasn't, what? I see, some said, like a snake, like a shame, what I owe, when nobody drew me from the road. What I do, now.
Thank you for coming and thank you, Dottie, for inviting me. I'm coming from Buenos Aires, and the text I wrote was inspired by this picture I saw on the internet in the Guardian website. This is in Indonesia, in Sumatra Island, and well, I think it's not possible when Dottie asked me to write about water. I think it's not possible to think about water and not think about pollution and the planet and the future, because we are living like in an ecological catastrophe that started with the Industrial Revolution. That's my text about. We cannot think about water without thinking about the economical system and social system we live in. Because if water is in risk, it's because of capitalism, basically, and of the economy we live today. So I have no idea what the future looks like, because I think the only future for water and for nature is a change of civilization that nobody knows really how it will be. But I think poetry and art has the task of imagining those possible new civilization, because this civilization we're living now based on consumption and consumo, sorry my English. Okay, cannot last longer, or we will all disappear. Maybe that will be the case. I don't know. The only chance is to imagine another way of conceiving everything. And I do think poets and artists can save the planet in the way that maybe some things that in literature or art look crazy today is the way that we will live in the future when this society changes, because I think poets and artists can imagine the future. So how it is, I don't know, but if we want to be optimistic, we have to trust in poets and not in politicians or businessmen. So Sorry for my English. If somebody doesn't understand something, please tell me. I have Jacob Steinberg, my dear poet and friend. I met in Buenos Aires more than 10 years ago now. Has helped me with the translation. So, but I know my accent is terrible. Okay, I try to read slow. The Argentinian actors that want to work in Hollywood do accent reduction workshops. I never did one of those. Okay. It's called Aguas Aéreas, aerial waters. I hope I never become a writer who hoards, a consumer, a writer who has brand new towels and sheets in her house and discards worn out things from the closet. One of those people who hate dishcloths that are faded or stained from meals prepared months or years ago. Stains from peaches, raw meat, or kitchen, grease stains. A writer, by definition, must ask to be called by gender-neutral pronouns, and further, they must have worn-out towels with blood or bleach stains, and sheets from many years ago with the elastic edges too stretched to fit the mattress anymore. To write is to accept the wearing away of objects. Poetry is like rust, stains of an impossibly orange color that slowly corrode the spine of life. I have meditated on it over the years. Life only exists to be consumed by poetry, like an iron pole knocked down by the mystery of oxidation. It's okay, or you prefer that Jacob reads it in good English? Yes? Sorry. Okay. It's too cold for this time of the year. It looks like fall. I am secluded in my house, watching Instagram accounts and trying to imagine the future, or at least my future. On the TV playing in the living room, they say it's snowing in Patagonia. Snow in January. Snow in the heart of summer. In Argentina, January is the summer. Okay. And it did snow this last January in Patagonia. It's really crazy. Last night, I had a very strange dream. I came across every object I have discarded since as far back as I can remember. I'm not talking about food scraps or things that don't really have a shape, like dust or wood splinters. What I'm referring to is all those other objects, things that would have been useful for something, but I threw away because I didn't have anywhere to put them, or didn't know what to do with them. Plastic bags, me and my son's toys, hundreds, thousands. Garden chairs, fake fur coats, oil and shampoo bottles. Like a Borgesian Aleph, biographical and partial, somebody or something, Mother Nature, took me to the basement of my building where the boiler room is and showed me a little luminous ball that contained every object I ever threw into the garbage. Well, it still has some use or could have been given as a present. Seeing them all provoked a great nostalgia in me for some of those things, and I wanted to have them back, although maybe it wasn't nostalgia but guilt. For example, a little porcelain tea set that my grandmother had given me in San Juan in 1978, which when I moved out alone for the first time in 1990, I left in the garbage can of my parents' house. So I stretched my hand into a shiny ball that contained the totality of my discarded belongings. In that moment, everything faded away, and after a few seconds of a kind of sticky and silvery darkness, the scene was new. Now I was an 11-year-old girl who lived in a wooden house in Sumatra. We were at the Java Sea, very close to the coast, and probably due to the humidity and sea salt, some of the plants that formed the walls of my were rotten. In the dream, I had absolute certainty that I was poor but happy. I only ate what the members of my extended family fished. My house, which for me was a palace, was surrounded by a huge floating tapestry, irregular and multicolored, made of plastic objects thrown into the sea, which grew bigger by the day and extended into the ocean, creating streetways in the ocean down which I could walk. Something that blew my mind and never ceased to amaze me. In the dream, I never went to school, so I didn't have the slightest idea that plastic degraded slowly, its molecules ending up in the stomachs of jellyfish and turtles, animals I loved. Thanks to my ignorance, the fact that the ocean currents had brought all those old, worn-out plastic items to my house was like a kind of miracle for me. Everything was beautiful and apocalyptic in this second part of the dream. I would have liked it if all the garbage had continued accumulating until I could reach the middle of the ocean. But unfortunately, some noise in the house, my teenage son doesn't go to bed until 6 a.m., woke me up before the sun came out. Since waking up a few hours ago, I'm in bed with my phone in my hand, drifting through social media. Do social media and poetry have something to do with each other? In a way, they are the manifestation of the immobile trip of the 17th century. Voyage autour de ma chambre, wrote Xavier de Maistre in 1794. I don't travel, that's why I will resurrect, wrote José Lezama Lima, who lived all his life on an island in Cuba. Soon, I will travel to New York to talk about water. In 2002, I met a German guy with whom I had sex one night, and he told me that he would never visit me because he was never going to take a plane in his life. A plane from Germany to Argentina pollutes more than 10,000 cars, I think he said. I don't know what the equivalent number of cars is for a plane going from Buenos Aires to New York. The first time I was in the USA, in 1997, I remember feeling terrorized by two things. The size of the stores and the size of the football stadiums. Really. Football stadiums in the middle of highways looked like monsters to me. The 24-hour-a-day supermarkets full of goods but empty of people seemed like hell to me. Or maybe hell was inside me and I projected it on American supermarkets. I had never seen shops that sold those huge boxes of cereal and jugs of milk of 10 liters or more. I was 24 and had my first panic attack. The expression panic attack didn't exist in Argentina yet. I quit my scholarship and came back to my country because I felt that in the United States, things were more important than people. When I told my psychologists, none of them understood. They said I couldn't feel bad just because objects proliferated in the world, that industry couldn't be the cause of my depression. In the 20 years since then, the whole world has started to look more and more like the United States. Panic attack became global. Now, in every country, goods are more important than people, and all the stores of the planet are full of useless things. They asked me to write about water, and the only thing I can think about, almost like an obsession, is how every object that has been made in an industry has taken water that isn't used for plants. Just so we can possess 50 pairs of pants and 40 sweaters and 100 shawls. When the Industrial Revolution started in Europe, Bettina von Arnim, the first feminist writer and political activist in Germany, went to take a walk in the woods and spoke to the river. She sought strength in Mother Nature to fight against the exploitation of the poor. She had a book called The Book of the Poor, ready to go to press, but the king censored it and that book never came out. Those texts inspired the Silesian weavers' uprising in 1844. The Silesian weavers were against the machines imported from England that produced 100 shawls in the time it took them to make 10. Soon I will have to take a long trip to talk about water and poetry. I feel taking a plane drives me away from poetry, away from the rust of every day, alike to the next one. The oxidation of days is what makes poems last forever. I only care about poetry if every poem I write includes my life's whole future. That is to say, if every new poem modifies my life forever and continues onward in time. It's hard to explain, but it's like walking forever with your poem on your back. If I give everything to my poem, I don't need to fill my life with objects. I want to give it all to my poem. Once, when I gave it all to my poem, people hugged me through the air. That happened a month ago, when I published a book in Buenos Aires, and many people sent me emails telling me that they wanted to have my book. Well, only one person did, but that's enough. Since then, I've understood that there could be love beyond water molecules, that love could take place through the air, that I don't need fluids to feel love. In 1991, Nestor Berlonger, an Argentinian poet with AIDS, traveled to the Amazon to die. There he wrote his last book, Aerial Waters, Aguas Aéreas. Throughout the book, rivers, lakes, and waterfalls appear in the sky. Air and water unseparated. Hallucinated waters, aerial waters, visual waters, reads a line. I could just not take the plane to go to the United States, but I want to meet Dorothy, who is a psychic poet. Actually, we are all psychic poets, but some of us don't know it yet. What it matters to me most in life is talking to other poets. Poetry is to want to live in the mind of others. It's snowing in Patagonia in January, and I remember I am a poet thanks to the snow. Ingrained in my memory, in a sharp, definitive way, is how poetry came to me. I was 7 years old, coming back from school. It was the last day of school, so it was the beginning of the summer, and a dazzling shrub with tiny white flowers made me think about snow. I had never seen snow in my life, but for a few seconds I was convinced I was seeing snow in summer, and I told myself, this is poetry. Poetry is seeing snow in summer. The Latin name of the plant is Spiraea cantoniensis. Now I have one of those shrubs in my yard, and I never forget that poetry for me started in a plant. Do I still have time? Okay. Some years later, when I had my first menstruation, I felt that poetry had to do with the tides inside my uterus. In April 1999, I wrote that my body contains millions of tears and millions of manuscripts. My house is my water, I wrote in a line that later I crossed out. Depending on the moment of my menstrual cycle, I have joy or sadness, desire for construction or distraction. And it's the same with poetry. Sometimes poetry is an escape and emptiness, or simply distraction and revenge. Many times poetry was revenge for me, and that was great. But since I got a poetry office in downtown Buenos Aires, poetry has started to travel through air and has become telepathy. Since I didn't have a job or steady income with my meager savings, I rented a space to found the Central Office of Poetry. There, we read poems written by other poets in a circle. After reading, we steal a line to start our own poems. Something like if a little cell with the DNA of the other poem mingles with our own poem in construction. Airborne DNA, because it only needs air to spread. It only needs the sound of our voices. Last week we stole a line from Borges. Soon I will know who I am. Now we are Cecilia, Jorge, Lucas, Malena, Ale, Diego, Jackie, Violeta, Abril, Juan, and we are Borges too, because our poem says, soon I will know who I am. The poetry office is 160 square feet with 12 chairs and 2 small card tables made of pine. The cheapest ones I found in the store. There is a shelf made with the tin of used painting cans that is starting to rust, and 12 glasses where we drink tea. The poetry office is in the financial district, that is to say, surrounded by banks. The only things circulating through the neighboring streets are armored trucks, but inside the poetry office, the only things circulating are words, rusted words, dead people's words being pronounced by the living over and over. A poetry workshop is the final proof of telepathy, the irrevocable confirmation that we are all writing the same poem. I have to write about water and poetry, but the only thing I can say about them is that water was the origin of poetry for me. Water is in the past. The present of poetry is in the air, because to write is to live in the mind of others, because poems travel through the air, stay in the atmosphere for centuries, and then plunge. Thank you.
So we were talking earlier about, how the water, that is us, that exists inside of us, has existed elsewhere, in other beings at some point, is, has a very deep time sense to it, and for me, I mostly write through found conceptual poetry, so I'm always looking to other people's writing to reconfigure and to recombine. So I think that process for me for going into that for going into the last million kids and pulling out all those descriptions of land and territory. I think there's there maybe is a relationship there for how text continues to exist in different forms of formations.
Well, I work as a translator. I've done that for 20 years already, so I think, I don't know what water has to do with it, but poetry and translation, well, maybe since I'm obsessed with the future civilization, we'll have to translate this world of today into another world. I don't know how it's going to be, but resources are going to, we are going to run out of resources, and we will have to translate this world into another one, and maybe we'll have to invent new ideas to deal with materials. I don't know. I have no idea. I get depressed every time I think about it. I don't know how you deal with that, or if you are aware of it here in New York. In the southern hemisphere, we are very aware of it because, of course, poor countries will get less worse conditions in the ecology. And, yeah, I don't know if it has to do with your question, but translation and into something else.
There's something in sort of vernacular folklore traditions called the floating stanza. And floating can relate to air or it can relate to water. And the basic idea of the floating stanza is a bit of language that exists in one source can move to another source. So this is something we see in hip hop all the time. Bits of phrases where there's like a party chant, and I get a party over here, a party over there. Can move, and it's oftentimes a feature of improvisational cultures, where you just need to keep the lyrics happening. You can just kind of bring language from one place to another. And so it's interesting to sort of think about if all the water is coming from other sources, what kind of gets pulled in from there. I mean, that photograph that you showed, Cecilia, like the idea of where stuff ends up running out of water to carry it, who ends up being the place where what's left gets, where it gets washed up, and where people end up finding it, where certain countries, certain cultures, certain economies find it okay to let what they don't want remain, or to place where they don't want. Like, not just allow it to end up, but to actually actively put it there. And how that, around the same idea about, sewage systems, running based on gravity. Like, well, then there's somebody who can carry whatever runs it, which is someplace else. But I think of like language and water being related in this way that we receive language, we carry ideas and concepts through a similar kind of flow and flooding, and language, at least in the realm of poetry, if you're willing to operate or able to operate outside of certain institutions where the flow of poetry can exist, it's one of the places where you can possibly imagine controlling certain kinds of flows. As institutional support for the writing of the poems themselves, outside of the teaching of poetry, as that shifts into teaching, the support shifts to teaching and not just the writing, one can begin to see that some of the incentive to write a certain kind of poetry might begin to decrease, and so more energy can be brought into controlling those kinds of flows. Anyway, that's
Yeah, it reminds me, I was watching a Trevor Noah video where I get all my news, and he was talking about this idea of forever chemicals that are chemicals that, companies kind of let happen in the water. I guess some forever chemicals come in like nonstick pans or different things like take-out containers, and they get in the water and they never degrade. And so we all have in our bloodstream these forever chemicals that we can't ever get rid of. And so I just was thinking about that when you were talking, all of you and Douglas, does that happen in language too, where there are like these forever chemicals that, we can't ever get out, and, maybe some of them are good, but some could be bad, I guess, obviously.
I think there might be tropes, but even those, I think that an interesting thing that happens is when people begin tracing back the origins of certain tropes and sort of not accepting the narrative that they were just sort of always there. But when you start thinking about plot structure, the kinds of things that we think about in terms of narrative, you kind of go, oh, there's a historical moment where that became kind of an investigation. We think about the sort of Aristotelian idea of plot, and then that's basically like an article that dramaturgy professors and English professors have just been teaching for a really long time. But it's actually a thing that happened. It's not just a thing we're born with. And so therefore, there's a decision that's made to go, let's keep doing this. Let's keep doing this. And then you get this sort of interesting sort of tautology. Is it that plays that get written have that structure because that is the structure of plays? Or is it because everybody writing plays studied that structure and then had a workshop where somebody says, no, you need to rise the action for this to be a play. Oh, okay. So forever chemical, a forever trope, I think that the way we articulate certain concepts or ideas, there's a discipline. And a discipline is an energetic activity that is about training you to do a specific thing. It is an act, it is an activity. It isn't just a neutral state. And so, there might be things that we want to treat, to change, to teach for a really long period of time. But I think one of the things that I've been hearing throughout the day is that even if we begin thinking about that idea that you were talking about a little earlier, you have to have these moments where you sort of take stock. What you were talking about, Cecilia, looking at this moment now, if it was ever imaginable to consume, we should have stopped and taken stock of that a long time ago now and changed whatever our idea about that was. Appetite may be forever as a concept, but how we express it, moving from valuing when we have access versus when we have little. I guess that's something connected to that.
Yeah, I think about that a lot, all the different ways the imagination is inhibited, and when we ask that question, can poets save the world, which I guess I'll ask you all, I didn't ask the second group, sorry. Is that possible? I think about, is it possible with constraints or forever constraints on the imagination? So I don't know if you want to talk about it, or, are there ways to think about that poets could save the planet?
Well, I think in the 18th century or 19th century, the only who traveled and who had a bourgeois life, or Goethe or people in Europe were traveling, and that became the desirable way of living for the masses in the 20th century. When these writers or artists were traveling, the normal people wouldn't imagine I can travel, So I think maybe what we are doing now with crazy poems, what I call psychic poems, but I say that you write Dorothea, I don't know, whatever, all the poets, is maybe imagining another way of existing that is totally different from this capitalist society. I hope. That's why I wrote we all write the same poem, because I think poetry has to or connects me. That was my experience. That I've been teaching these poetry workshops every day, to make a living basically, but it's really non-institutional space. And then very strange things start to happen, like people repeat a line, they write it in their homes, and they come to read it in the workshop, or they just write something I was going to give them that day, and the themes repeat all the time. So that's why I said we all write the same poem, and I think maybe the future that poetry is telling us is that we have to understand not ourselves not as individuals, or we have to understand it's some other kind of connection. So that is not the rational mind, because the rational mind, European white rational minds that distracted, I mean, this idea of intelligence that we all have, it's distraction. It's what made science also is distraction at the end. So maybe poetry that looks stupid, silly, crazy, maybe that's another way of thinking that is not colonial, not destroying the planet. I don't know, but I have no idea.
Such a hard question. And I feel so torn about it. Because on the one hand, I, as a writer of things, I want to say that writing does something. And on the other hand, I kind of feel like it doesn't do anything. So, I don't know, honestly, I have thought about this question a lot in the last couple of years, and I think, it's really difficult for me to say that, like when I've talked before about, like writing and, climate catastrophe, for example, like I don't know what writing does. And, like we were talking earlier about missing and murdered Indigenous women, I don't know what writing does, to confront those issues. But, at the same time, I think, maybe writing does something maybe to illuminate the set of circumstances in which we find ourselves living in. And I don't know if that's enough, but it's something, maybe.
I mean, sometimes I think there's like this kind of like, if it doesn't do the whole thing, then it must be useless. And I don't know if that's right. I think that, one of the things that was said in the earlier panel, and I think about this a lot, it's like you were saying, Jordan, that for some people, they don't know about certain things, and that can anger people for whom that thing is deeply important. And that's real, and that should be honored. But if something you write or something you say now makes it possible for somebody else to know, that does do a thing, because somebody in that room might have the right combination of will, talent, and connection to do something about that you can't. And that's real. I think that's what community means, right? Like that's what community is. Like community, if a single person could do everything we need, we actually wouldn't need community. We would be be that destructive model, libertarian model of America, right? So we wouldn't need to talk to each other. I guess what I say is like, if we say that writing ultimately doesn't believe, then what we're also saying is we don't actually need to communicate. We don't need community. And so and that's something that I think about like, as I'm sitting here. So I guess that's sort of like, oh shit, that's the fucking trick. That's the trick. That's you going. That's like going, shut up, shut the fuck up, shut up, and eventually kind of going, fuck, yeah. It's not the only thing. It's not all. But I think it's a part of it. At the same time, there are people out there who are actively deciding they don't care. And so the other side of the trick is when we get ourselves into a position to believe that it is our fault, that if we just figure out how to write this line to make it so that we can make somebody who actively doesn't care about other human beings care about them. That it is somehow our fault that given the history of human experience and everyone who's written, who's died, who's marched, who's sang, who's painted, all of those people who've come before us just didn't do it right. And maybe we could just figure out that metaphor to turn this deformed fucking human being into a person that will care about somebody else, and because they don't do it, that's somehow our fault because we didn't have the right simile. That's bullshit too. So, writing doesn't do it alone, but the second we say it doesn't mean anything, then we are agreeing that we actually don't need each other. And the second we believe that the people who actually are actively not caring are able to do it because we just haven't figured out how to pull their heartstring in just the right way, I think that's when we need to look at the other resources and other talents and other people in our community to go like, how can we inspire you to do something about them? Because they're not listening to me, so now maybe it's you. But it's not alone. It's not alone. Writing won't do it alone. But as a part of a community where writing is just one of the skills, yeah, it's a part of it, but I think that's where I am. Who knows? Tomorrow I might be like, oh no shit. I don't know. But right now, with what I've been hearing today, and what I've been thinking about the last 2-3 weeks, what you said really helped clarify that for me. And I wouldn't have that if we weren't in here talking about that. And so I'm grateful for that, but that doesn't happen without this.
That was an amazing answer. I'm very grateful for that response, and I think that's really meaningful to me. Thank you.
And I'm not from this country, but I think you have elections soon. So I think it's very important what you said in relation to that.
Well, would anyone in the audience like to answer your question? I don't feel like it really follows that. Conrad.
Cecilia, could you please talk more about telepathy and poetry?
Well, I'm in general, I'm very, how do you say, skeptical about everything, about esoteric things and religious things. But since I'm skeptical, those things happen, and so I can't deny them. And I don't know, also I met an American poet 10 years ago. He's a friend of his. And we started to do an exchange in poems, emails. And I realized how powerful it is to try to talk through a poem form and how you connect to others. I don't know if I can explain it, because I think that's the good thing about poetry is that you have to live it to understand it. No? Don't you agree? So we were doing this project with this man, and I was thinking about something to write in my poem, and then suddenly an email came with a similar topic that I was thinking. Maybe it's nothing special, it's just that I think poetry uncovers the way we are all connected, but we have, how do you say, denied it. For me, in my workshop, I have like 50 people coming to my space weekly. And then suddenly, I see that the poems are very similar, or talk about the same, but really like topics that have nothing contemporary, and I really don't know how this is just, it happens when people start to get together and write and want to open to this kind of language that is different than the other language. So, but I don't know. I think that will be discovered in the future. Maybe all our cell phones are telepathy already. I don't know. Maybe.
Maybe we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Sorry to take the space if anyone else was wanting to ask. I had a question which is a lot less metaphysical than the discussion that we just had. Sorry to bring it down a level. But I'm curious about the genre of poetry and just thinking about this as a poetry event. And then also the transmission of poetry. And I think especially in your work, Cecilia, you talked about the way that poetry is carried through air and held in the atmosphere. So, and then in your work, Jordan, you were also talking about like this intergenerational transmission of ideas of art, of trauma and violence. So I was wondering if you all could speak a little bit about transmission. And then on the topic of genre, I was thinking of a review of your work, Douglas, in the Rumpus, that said, oh, this is more than poetry. And there's this feeling that your work is like going beyond somehow, or doing something other than poetry. And obviously in your incredible performance today, there were aspects of theory, spirituality, sort of social materiality, this moment of like rapture when you're falling from the lectern. So I was wondering if you could talk about this idea of, is your work more than poetry? And maybe I could pose this to all of you, and like if so, what might that mean?
I guess I'll start us off. I think so. We're in New York. I assume everyone here loves Tommy Pico as much as I do. Yes. One of the things I love is one of the lines in Tommy Pico's book, Nature Poem. Says, I hopefully I won't misquote it, but I think he says poetry is a container. And the more I think about that line, the more it resonates with me that there are all these multitudes of things that are possible that poetry, can contain, or exist within poetry in some ways. And I think, my writing, my personal writing, is writing that is all multi-genre in some way. Like the piece I read today, maybe is conceptual poetry, but it's also maybe just conceptual fiction. But is very convenient to talk about under the banner of poetry, because poetry is a place that accepts that kind of blending in some way or another. So I'm open to poetry's expansive possibilities, and I think they are expansive.
I agree with that, and I think that poetry is so capacious. I mean, there's so many different traditions within poetry. I love locating myself in poetry, even when I'm doing things that are more sort of visually oriented. I'm really focusing on the idea of reading, not looking, right? There's a tension there, and I'm really interested in what I feel like a reader brings to encountering that field. What a reader and what the sort of associative space of performance creates for me is just trying to reproduce where my imagination is when I'm writing a poem. So instead of describing why I wrote a poem, I just try to make the space between poems that place. And so the room becomes that associative space, and so what happens, happens. And so the decisions I make in performance are the same way I'm trying to make decisions about what the next line's going to be, and see what happens out of that. So I think that it can hold all of those things, theory, spirituality, performance, all of those things, sound, image. So I agree.
Yes, and I agree with you both, and I would add politics, because as what he said about the community, I think when politics starts in the community, in talking to each other in a way, in a different way, is when it can get stronger. And so it is also a way of living this idea of like imagining another way of communicating, and that can become political and I don't know, a different perception of life. For me, art at the end, like I only care about reading other poems and writing poems. It's like it's better than being ambitious or trying to